It's 5 a.m., Wednesday, July 3rd, 1901. We're 12,000 feet high in the San Juan Mountains in a bunkhouse at the Smuggler Union Mine just northeast of Telluride. There's frost on the roof, even though it's July. We're truly in the Alpine. Two miners, Robert McCollum and his friend Jay Luan, are sound asleep in their bunks. They're awakened by the sound of gunfire. Just a few shots, separated in time. Maybe someone was getting a mountain goat for dinner? Luan was from Mexico and ran tram carts in the mine. They called them trammers. He jumped from his bunk and runs out to check out what's going on. McCollum thinks twice and decides to stay inside. Things have been tense lately and he plays it safe, rolls over, and goes back to sleep. Luan runs out to find his peers, all non-union miners, facing off with a group of 25 union miners. The Smuggler Union Mine was operating during a mine workers' strike with laborers that had crossed the picket line, scab laborers. All Luan's non-union buddies had their rifles drawn, and he didn't see any guns on the other side. It must have been his colleagues that had fired those shots, maybe into the air, into the ground, trying to tell the union miners to get the heck out of here and off this company property. The party of union miners retreated, walking backwards. But as his peers walked back toward him, he could tell right away that something was very wrong. They don't look proud or victorious having chased the Union guys off. They instead gesture down valley and to the ridgelines with their eyes that are full of terror. The valley that the mine sits in is surrounded by hundreds of Union miners, every one of them with a rifle. Then he sees that one of his buddies, the nighttime shift boss who had been recently deputized to the sheriff's office and armed by the mining company, he was limping, bleeding from the hip. Luan, suddenly grasping the full reality of the situation and realizing they've been ambushed, sprints back for his rifle. And just then, the air ignites with bullets hissing through the air. The ground, the rocks, the buildings all suddenly shatter as bullets smack all around them. Back in the bunkhouse, McCollum jolts awake when the bullets start flying around him, and he suddenly sees daylight streaming through bullet holes in the tin roof. It sounds like there's an entire army outside. He rolls off his bunk onto the floor and army crawls to a corner next to the foundation for shelter. Luan puts up a fight, returning fire as long as he's able, but ultimately pays the price, and his body is riddled with bullets. The dramatic events of the morning are the culmination of a labor dispute that's been brewing for the last 63 days. The miners' union has been on strike since May 1st, demanding a uniform workday with minimum wage instead of the contract and piecemeal system that the mine owners preferred. Requests that really we think of as fundamental rights today. But the rich and powerful mine owners and a few desperately poor miners had had it with the standoff and the lack of work. So a superintendent of the Smuggler Union Mine opened the mine with non-union scabs. The superintendent knew that the unions were capable of violence and thus armed his scab workers and swore several of them in as deputies of the town sheriff and the mine. This non-union or scab mine had incensed the local union miners, and they prepared for war, ordering 250 rifles and 50,000 rounds of ammunition to be sent from Denver, all bought and paid for by the union. And on the night before the shootout, the union sent 300 miners with rifles up to the Smuggler Union Mine from Telluride. The men, now really a militia, surrounded the mine and its buildings, and at 5 a.m. sent what they claimed was an unarmed party of 25 union miners to persuade the scabs to stop work and join the strike. Despite the union guys' claims that their party of 25 was unarmed, the union shift boss was indeed shot in the hip. The scabs, having received strict instruction to keep the union miners off the property, fired threatening shots into the air and into the ground to tell the union miners to buzz off. They probably used more colorful language. But that was all the union needed. The 25 union miners retreated to their ranks, and together the 300-member militia opened fire onto the mine camp. The shootout and standoff lasted about 6 hours that morning and ultimately ended with only 3 fatalities. A non-union shift boss that was shot in the hip, 1 union militia member, and 1 brave, or maybe foolish, non-union trammer named Lujuan. After the non-union miners waved a white flag, the union rounded up the 100 or so scab miners, Robert McCollum among them, having crawled out from his shelter by the bunkhouse foundation, and they put white handkerchiefs in their hands and marched them over Imogene Pass to Ouray, telling them to never again return to Telluride or San Miguel County. And look, we'll have to save the labor dispute in Telluride for another podcast, but sneak peek, it didn't go well for the union. They ended up being crushed when the Colorado governor ordered in the National Guard, the first in a string of brazen, lawless, violent, union-busting efforts that spread through mining towns across the state, all sanctioned by Colorado's railroad man-turned-governor at the time, James Bradley Orman. But Robert McCollum went on with his life and ended up down in Montrose running a boarding house for surveyors of the Gunnison Tunnel. He was chief cook and bottle washer of the boarding house and later became postmaster of the one. Robert McCollum was a fixture in town and was credited with naming the settlement built for the tunnel construction near the West Portal. He named it after his brave Mexican trammer buddy from Telluride that had been shot full of holes at the Smuggler Union Mine in the summer of 1901. They somehow added an E to the end of Lujan, Lujane, casting doubt to the pronunciation. I've found every pronunciation and discussion of them in the historical record. Lujane, Luwana, Luwan. According to Elaine Hale-Jones, who's written several historical books about the valley, residents use both Luwana and Lujane. But according to McCollum's daughter, as about as close to the source as it gets, it's Luwan. It's kind of funny. There seems to be a theme of dual pronunciations in the Uncompahgre Valley. Locals say Ouray, tourists say Ouray. Old-timers say Montrose, later arrivals say Montrose. People not from here say Olathe, locals say Olathe. Anyway, the town of Lujane, Luwan, Luwana, was the heart of the Gunnison Tunnel project. My name is Brody Wilson, and I live in the Uncompahgre Valley. I'm a mechanical engineer here in Colorado and work in corporate sustainability, but having grown up right next to the primary canal that carries Gunnison Tunnel water, my life was shaped and infused by the water that flows through this tunnel. This is the third of 4 episodes in which I'm telling you the story of the Gunnison Tunnel and associated canals, collectively known as the Uncompahgre Project. In the last 2 episodes, we covered the early survey work and initial construction challenges. If you haven't listened to those, I encourage you to do so before listening to this. In this episode, we'll go deep on the actual construction and engineering and continued challenges the project faced during construction. In our 4th and final episode, we'll cover the tunnel's operation and impact on the valley today. I'm telling this story because most of us take our water for granted. And for those of us that live in the arid western U.S., there's a story like this one behind every city, town, and agricultural valley in the West. And while water is sure to remain a crucial issue for decades to come in the Colorado River Basin, I think we'll all just make better decisions if we understand just how much has gone into enabling our water use today, our way of life, really. Before we dive back into the tunnel construction, let's do a quick recap. Daring early survey efforts culminated with Torrens and Fellows determining that the Gunnison River was enough higher than the Uncompahgre River to irrigate the Uncompahgre Valley, and that a tunnel was feasible. The U.S. Geological Survey created the U.S. Reclamation Service, and one of theirs, Ira McConnell, decided on the final location of the tunnel, and construction began. But the contractor they selected wasn't up to the task and folded after just 5 months of construction. And just 3 days after that, the tunnel experienced a devastating cave-in near the West Portal, killing 6 men. The cave-in was the result of water from the Cimarron Ditch being routed on top of the tunnel. One other item to keep you oriented here. Remember, tunnel boring is happening in 4 places at once. These are known as headings. Heading number 1 from the east or the river portal. Headings 2 and 3 accessed via an elevator from the main shaft. And finally, heading 4 from the valley near Luwan going east. if you're like me, you might still be wondering, how did they actually dig this thing? And if you've never been on a mine tour, you probably don't have an accurate picture in your head. So let's dig in, shall we? First, there's what's called the face of the tunnel, where the tunnel is being pushed forward. And of course, as you dig, the material you're removing falls off the tunnel face and onto the floor. And somehow that material has to get out of the tunnel. Well, that's the job of the muckers. These are the guys that shovel the material off the floor and into the cars. The cars are mining carts that sit on steel rails like a small train and carry about 35 cubic feet. That's about 1.2 yards for you concrete folks listening. These cars were initially pulled by horses and mules, and after McConnell took over the job, by electric trams. Then the tram drivers would haul the carts out of the tunnel to where the material could be dumped. Nothing to it. Well, wait a minute. We also have to make sure this tunnel doesn't collapse down on the workers. So, like in a mine, they timbered. And by this, we mean placing strong milled timber, picture railroad ties, in the proper dimensions. These hold out the earth that so desperately wants to cave in on our tunnel. They actually cut the timbers mostly from federal land up on the Big Cimarron, not far from where the Cimarron ditch is diverted. Okay, well, we can picture that system working. Scrape away the face, shovel the dirt into the cars, remove the dirt, place the timbers, repeat. Now, hold on. This tunnel's like 13 feet tall. How are you going to scrape, chip, and hammer way up there? Scaffolding, you might think? Talk about a hassle. There's an easier way. It's called the heading and bench method, where you start digging at the top of the tunnel and carve away a bench for the whole crew to stand on. They made this top heading about 8 foot by 8 foot and would press that smaller face forward, keeping the ceiling at the proper height, even placing temporary timbers, then come back in a second pass, widening the tunnel to its final dimensions. Really a two-step process. Okay, so now we got it. Now we can start digging, right? Wait a minute. There's another problem. As we get deeper, the air quality starts to get really bad. So, okay, no problem. We just pump some air back there. Good, the workers at the face now have fresh air, but oh no, now all the other workers, the muckers and the trammers, the guys running the cars and the timber crews are getting all the dirty exhaust air off the face. Okay, no problem. Let's just run another pipe down near the face and suck the dirty air out. Problem solved. But wait, now we're running into rock. Like really hard rock. Rock bars and picks ain't moving this stuff. And now we look to the process the hard rock miners in Telluride and Ouray had been perfecting for years, using, you guessed it, explosives. And in the early days of the tunnel, that meant black powder. Okay, so we got plenty of that, but when you light black powder out on the table, it just kind of burns and fizzles. If you want it to go boom, you've got to pack it into a confined space. We need some holes in this rock into which we can pack black powder. Well, that means it's time to pull out the rock drills. Okay, now hang on. We got to go a little deeper on how rock drills worked in 1905, especially those used for drilling blasting holes. If you don't already know this, you're not going to believe me. So you take your friend and you hand him a drill. It's like a 3/4 inch thick bar of steel, ranging in length from about a foot to a couple feet. It has an X-shaped chipping head on the end. So you say to your buddy, "Hey, Jack, hold this right there against the wall. I'm going to hit the end of it with this sledgehammer as hard as I can. Yeah, don't worry, I won't miss." Then you heft your 5-pound sledge and you swing it for all you're worth, striking the drill and chipping a little rock out. Then your friend Jack rotates the drill a quarter turn and you swing again. Now remember, you're working in the dark. I mean, pitch dark. But hey, no problem. That's why you brought your candle. You've got your and Jack's candles burning brightly. As I say this, I can't stop thinking about a tour of the Bachelor Syracuse mine that my family and I went on last summer. It's just 10 minutes north of Ouray, and the guide takes you back about 1,500 feet into an old hard rock silver mine. Once you get all the way back, you turn off your headlamps, and the guide lights a couple candles. Then our guide, she had a volunteer, that was me, hold a rock drill against the wall, and she lifted the sledge and she said, "Okay, Jack, here we go." It was awesome. She did not actually take a swing at the drill, thank God. I'll link to the Bachelor Syracuse mine tour in the show notes. Okay, so you're starting to get the picture, right? Well, not quite. Now we get to the explosives. So you've got somewhere between 30 and 75 of these holes drilled in the tunnel face. It took like 8, 16, 20 hours to drill them all. The method used at the beginning of the project was to pack the hand-drilled holes with black powder, blasting powder, light a fuse, and run a safe distance back, and then the muckers go in and load up the debris. Easy peasy. That's not actually that simple. First of all, black powder at times was super unstable. If you tamp it into the hole too hard, bad day. Make a spark with your tamping rod, bad day. And there were lots of innovations in the approach to blasting, like how deep you drill the holes, what pattern you use. These guys weren't just like drilling a bunch of holes at random, filling them with black powder and lighting it off. It turns out that miners at the time had worked out ideal patterns and carefully timed their explosives in a specific firing pattern to loosen the most rock possible without fracturing the rock that you wanted to remain as the tunnel wall or ceiling, what mine engineers call perimeter control. Look, mine engineers, they get really into this stuff and ultimately specify very precise locations of charges and control the firing patterns on the face very precisely. The charges in different places on the tunnel face have different names like cut holes and blast holes and floor holes and contour holes. It's like a whole science. Go to the Colorado School of Mines if you really want to learn more. Okay, so now the tunnel face is littered with holes, and the foreman has cut fuses in specific lengths to sequence the explosion just so. And he, with his candle, lights the fuse. Now what? You're a couple thousand feet back in the tunnel with nowhere to go. So these guys would just walk back, I don't know how far, but definitely not out of the tunnel, turn their backs, cover their ears, and wait? I'm sure they knew about how long they had, but these guys were not carrying pocket watches. I'm sure they knew how long their fuses were, but I'm picturing them walking back and counting 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 91 Mississippi, 92 Mississippi. Later, they did move to electronic blasting caps instead of fuses that allowed for much more precise control. And hopefully the ventilation took care of most of the products of combustion, but certainly not all. These guys were not wearing respirators and were breathing all kinds of rock dust, silica dust, something we now know today is murder for your lungs. The tiny quartz crystals flow all the way down into your lungs, all the way into the alveoli, the tiny air sacs in your lungs where gases are exchanged with your blood. Yeah, in there where your immune system wraps around the silica, causing inflammation and ultimately scarring, forever reducing your lungs' gas exchange efficiency in that spot. It's called silicosis, a debilitating and sometimes fatal disease. Anyway, so now you're starting to get the picture. It's called the drill, fill, blast, muck cycle to tunneling, and the crews of the Gunnison Tunnel went on drilling and filling and blasting and mucking and drilling and filling and blasting and mucking for years. And the method was really credited to this guy from Montreal, Francis Shanley, who was awarded the contract to finish the Hoosac Railroad Tunnel in western Massachusetts. The Hoosac Tunnel was actually the nation's current longest tunnel at the time at 4.75 miles, but not for long if Ira McConnell had anything to say about it. Okay, so on the west side, they're tunneling through dangerous adobe mud and shale where they have to timber like crazy to keep the darn thing from caving in again. On the east side, the rock is hard granite. It's the bottom of the Black Canyon, and cave-ins are less of a concern, but progress is slow. I mean slow. But ultimately, with improved tools and explosives, they really got cooking and set a tunneling record through granite at the time, which was 449 feet in 1 month. Still, that's just shy of 15 feet per day. Other times, they made next to no progress for months on end. On the east side, they used a different tram system with bigger 54 cubic foot cars that required the use of a derrick or a crane to dump the cars. Okay, so now you're starting to get the picture. Drill, fill, blast, muck. Well, especially after Taylor Moore was off the job, McConnell started optimizing things and getting better tools into the hands of the crews. One of the bigger advancements was the transition from black powder to dynamite. You've heard about the Nobel Prize, right? Well, Alfred Nobel, after which the prize is named, and his father are both Swedish chemists. and they saw the potential for the use of nitroglycerin in controlled explosions. But the thing was that nitroglycerin, a liquid at room temperatures, was super unstable. Drop a bottle of this stuff? But one day, Alfred the son was in a nitroglycerin factory in Germany and came across a cask of nitroglycerin that had leaked into its tenacious earth packing material. The stuff had kind of dried into granules. Nobel experimented with the powder, finding that the material could be roughly handled without danger, but a blasting cap could cause it to explode with nearly as much force as pure nitroglycerin. Being so much less sensitive to shock, the granular substance seemed ideal for handling and shipping. Nobel named this diatomaceous earth nitroglycerin mixture dynamite, from the Greek dynamis for power. Wrap some in a paper roll and dip the whole thing in paraffin wax to make it waterproof, and now we have something much safer and much more predictable than raw black powder. So McConnell switched all the blasting to dynamite. Good move. I mentioned in the last episode that McConnell also improved the other project infrastructure. This included huge upgrades to the air compressors, we'll get to those in a minute, blowers for pushing ventilation air into and pulling exhaust air out of the tunnel, and electric generators, or dynamos, as some folks called them back then. Remember dynamis, Greek for power? All of this equipment was powered by the same motive force that was underpinning the industrialization of the globe at the time: steam. And the way you make steam is by boiling water. And the way you did that at the time was to burn coal. Lots of coal. So if you look at pictures of the powerhouses at Luan and at the East Portal, both powerhouses have 4 huge smokestacks rising out of them. These were for the boilers. And stationary engineers, as they're still called today, carefully monitored the boilers, ensuring that they had enough water in them and didn't run dry and explode, and were providing as much steam as the air compressors and blowers and dynamos required. And firemen, the poor guys shoveling coal and removing clinkers, the hard rocks left after the coals burned, they kept the boilers' fireboxes fueled and cleaned out. These were serious industrial powerhouses. It wasn't quite like the engine room of the Titanic, but not too far off. They were critical to the project. If something went wrong in the powerhouse, everything stopped. Lives were at risk. I keep picturing McConnell and Quinton, having gotten their feet under themselves after the cave-in and not having Taylor Moore making decisions anymore. I see them sitting together in the office one afternoon being like, okay, let's quit screwing around. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. Forget all these candles and hand drills and black powder. That's so 1890. We're in the 20th century now. Let's get serious. So they made the decision and requested the funds to invest in these huge powerhouses, this really foundational infrastructure for the project. And so candles were replaced with electric lights, hand drills were replaced with powerful pneumatic drills, mules and horses were replaced with electric trams, ventilation was increased, and the project really accelerated. The other super interesting artifact I found when I went to the National Archives in Broomfield, Colorado, again on a blueprint reeking of chemicals, but it was a huge diagram of the tunnel construction infrastructure. It was titled Diagrammatic Charts Showing Organization of Working Force and Distribution of Motive Power, Gunnison Tunnel, October 1905. Again, I'll link to a picture of it in the show notes. It has a really nice diagram of the organization. McConnell is at the top, then the River Portal organization for Heading 1 is detailed on the left, and the Cedar Creek Portal and Shaft organizations for Heading 2, 3, and 4 are detailed on the right. Every team has a box, and every major employee is named with their title. This is what we corporate desk jockeys call an org chart. Let me describe just the River Portal crew for you. There was a timekeeper who kept track of everyone's hours, also supply and property agent. Below him was the commissary and boarding house manager, a weighing clerk, teams and teamsters for transportation of goods, a bookkeeper for general accounting. Then there was a superintendent for the construction, and under him a master mechanic and outside foreman, and under that foreman a carpenter, a blacksmith, two tool sharpeners, 3 stationary engineers, and 3 firemen, and 5 to 12 laborers for pipe, road, and other miscellaneous work. Then there was the tunnel foreman, Theodore Grasser. Yeah, that guy stayed on after he dug himself out of the cave-in with his fingernails and became the foreman of the River Portal tunnelers. He had 6 drillmen, 3 drill helpers, 9 muckers, 1 engineer running the hoist and derrick, 1 trammer, and 1 tram horse for each shift. That's 20 guys, 21 if you count the horse, each shift. And they ran 3 shifts a day. Grasser had 63 workers under his supervision actually doing the digging. But we're not done yet. Now we get to the white-collar jobs. There was an engineer in charge at River Portal, Joseph Sargent. He did the primary tunnel levels, alignment and measurements. This was the guy that really kept them digging on course, but also general inspections, budgets, and progress reports to McConnell, Quinton, and the higher-ups. This guy had 4 engineers below him, assistant engineer, road maintenance engineer, and 2 field assistants that did river soundings, tunnel work, and topography. Phew, that's just the east portal. The west portal was even bigger because they were working on 3 faces simultaneously and had the main material yard, the steam shovel operations for the canal, electricians, corrals for the teams and teamsters, policemen, even more finance and purchasing agents. It was a huge operation. Now, the coolest part of this blueprint, at least for me, where I'm getting all of this information, is that the engineer that drew it, Joseph Sargent, included schematic diagrams of the powerhouses at the east and west portal. And if you're not a mechanical person, just plug your ears while I geek out on this for a minute and I describe these powerhouses. First, at Luan, at the west portal, the engineer shows 3 settling basins filling a 3.5 million gallon reservoir that is all filled with Cimarron ditch water. 4 coal-fired steam boilers produce 320 horsepower worth of steam to everything. Feed water pumps to the boilers, 3 Lehner compound steam air compressors making 1,500 CFM of 100 PSI air. Steam from the boilers also spun several 100 horsepower Erie Engine Works steam engines that turned Gardner electric generators or dynamos, producing a total of 275 kW at 250 volts. The compressed air left the one powerhouse in 2 directions. To the west, it was used on the 60-ton Buyer steam shovel and the hoist engine over there and several pumps that were pumping water to the rock drills. And on the east, toward the tunnel, of course, for the pneumatic rock drills, but also for a Jeffries coal boring machine. Another hoist engine for the main shaft that dropped down to headings 3 and 4 also ran on compressed air, and a 20 horsepower blower for ventilation that also ran on compressed air, and 2 forges. These guys were using compressed air all over the place. Of course, the boilers also made hot water so everyone could have a hot shower after their shift. That had to be nice. The infrastructure on the east or the river portal was very similar, except the east portal's powerhouse air compressors were twice as big. They had a bunch of compressed air-powered duplex pumps to pump water out away from the face. They also had a huge blower providing 6,000 CFM of fresh air at 2 PSI. The pumping infrastructure ended up being a major challenge and had to be upgraded several times as more and more water was encountered as they went. I linked to a couple videos of people that have restored these old steam engines and pneumatic pumps in the show notes. Check them out. They're actually pretty cool. Okay. You non-mechanical folks can unplug your ears now. Enough geeking out. Let's get back to the story. So McConnell and Quinton got in there and really started kicking butt. But Verno Mesa, through which they were tunneling, was not giving up the fight that easily. She still had many more tricks up her sleeve to make life miserable for the tunnel team. The crews ran into just about everything as they dug. The tunnel passes through a wide variety of soil and rock types, and on the west side was a ton of shale. In here, they'd find big pockets of combustible gases, which it seems like they never ignited thanks to good ventilation, but also other non-combustible gases, toxic gases, especially CO2. Sometimes it was pockets of CO2 directly, what they called choke damp. Other times, it was the result of carbonic acid in the soil coming in contact with water and producing CO2. Now, we breathe CO2 in very low concentrations every day, but if you've ever breathed pure CO2, you know, it's terrible. It'll kill you within a few breaths if you're in a confined space. This is something every brewer gets in their safety training. Anyway, these combustible and non-combustible toxic gases were often mixed in with the water flow. There were several occasions that they drill into a pocket of gas and water mix, and the pressure blew the drillers off their rig. On one occasion, a water jet shot 40 feet back into the tunnel. Yay. On several occasions, the gas and water flow were so bad it drove the crews out of the tunnel. Okay, so picture this. The crew hits a pocket of gas and water and gets driven back from the face and out of the tunnel because they're choking on CO2. Then eventually everyone, the drillers, the muckers, the trammers, and ultimately the timber crew all get driven out of the tunnel. You just can't go in the tunnel because if you do, you die. So now what? McConnell and his team now have literally hundreds of workers chomping at the bit to get their hours in and earn their pay. And if they can't get their hours, these guys are gone. So you wait a day, maybe two, but the tunnel just keeps spewing toxic gas, no end in sight. So let's try turning up the ventilation blowers, you thought. That's not enough. Install bigger blowers. How about that? No, still not enough. Well, crap, now what? Well, they resorted to digging a ventilation shaft down to the tunnel from the surface above. Yeah, just like the rescue effort from the cave-in the last episode, but bigger. Way bigger. The first ventilation shaft they had to dig was 4 foot by 7 foot and 680 feet deep. These were huge efforts. I mean, that's like a whole new tunnel. And it took 6 months to dig and timber. The progress on heading 2 was stopped for that full 6 months. And this happened twice. The second time required a 400-foot tunnel and caused a 3-month delay. Oh yeah, and have I mentioned shale slacking to you? No? Well, that's where a solid that, when dry, has a nice firm texture, kind of like a crystal. But when wetted, it slacks into small granules. Yeah, well, much of the shale they were digging through was seabed, old ocean floor, like ocean from 75 to 85 million years ago old. It's called the Menka Shale, and it's full of fossilized sea critters. In fact, in one spot, they had to use special timbering because the tunnel passed through 500 feet of almost entirely fossilized clams. Turns out these things are called brachiopods. Anyway, in all the writing, they cite the, quote, slacking of shale causing hellishly hot working conditions. And I didn't understand that. How does shale getting wet and turning into mud make heat? So I had to do some investigating, and it turns out that shale around here has a lot of calcium in it and likely some calcium oxides. And when you wet calcium oxide, it produces calcium hydroxide and heat. Heat is a byproduct of that chemical reaction. It's called lime slacking. Anyway, this chemical reaction was happening all around them and making the tunnel hotter and hotter. So you combine that heat with the humidity of the infiltrating groundwater and the water from the rock drills, and you start to get a pretty nice little sauna going down in there. No kidding. It was actually just terrible. So yeah, it's like 90 degrees and 100% humidity, and the pneumatic rock drills are loud as all get out. I didn't see one reference to or photo of hearing protection in my research. The air quality ranges from, pretty good, you only get mild silicosis, to, take another breath and you'll die. And on the east side, you're standing in water the whole time. Remember, when complete, the tunnel has to slope down from the east to the west. That's what makes the water flow through it. But that also means that when you're digging from the east side, any water that comes in the tunnel flows down to the tunnel face. So let's say you want to set your drill on the ground for a minute to change a bit or something. Nope, can't set it on the ground, that's water. Or maybe just set your lunch pail on the ground till lunchtime. Nope, it'll float away. They worked in ankle to knee-deep water for years. Imagine that. In the 5th Annual Reclamation Service report, McConnell says it pretty well himself.
Before a proper appreciation of the difficulty of this work can be realized, it must be recognized that in many respects it is an unprecedented undertaking. At the present time, an expenditure of nearly 100 horsepower is required for tunnel ventilation alone. Every car of material taken from the tunnel must be hauled an average a distance of 2 miles before it reaches the dump. Water flowing into the tunnel must be pumped long distances before it is finally discharged. The material through which the tunnel has been excavated has been extremely difficult to handle in many places. The country in which the work is located is not self-supporting. This has required the shipment from outside points of practically every pound of supplies used. Freights are high, labor is scarce, and correspondingly indifferent. Supplies of all classes are commanding the highest prices ever realized. All these factors increase the difficulty and the expense.
It wasn't just challenging in the tunnel. Work was hard outside the tunnel, too. For example, getting materials down to the East Portal. I described the East Portal Road in my last episode, but it has grades of up to 22% and descends 2,000 feet in just over 7 miles. And if you drive it today, you've got to put your car in first gear so you don't smoke your brakes. But I'm curious, has this one crossed your mind yet? How in the heck did they get heavy wagons carrying literally 2,000 pounds of coal down the road without having runaway wagons that killed drivers and their teams? Did the wagons even have brakes in 1905, or did the horses hold the weight back, leaning backwards into their yokes or something? No way. Well, I got the answer in a recording of a presentation that Jerry Gunnison gave to the Montrose Historical Society back in 2011. Jerry was the gatekeeper down in the East Portal for the Uncompahgre Valley water users for a long time. I actually went to high school with his daughter, who drove over Vernal Mesa to Montrose every day for school. Anyway, the wagons did have brakes, but not like what you're picturing. Every loaded wagon that went down the East Portal Road was provided with an iron shoe that was installed on a back wheel. This device looked a little bit like a ski, that the wheel rode on. The ski has a trough that the wheel sits in, and there's a chain from the tip of the ski that was fastened up to the body of the wagon. So in this way, the wheel could not roll, and the ski simply slid along. They basically turned one of the wheels into a skid, and that was apparently enough to keep the heavy wagons slow enough to not run away from the drivers. I wonder if they made the shoes grippier with studs or something when it snowed. I'm not sure I'd want to do that when the road was slippery. Okay, so we've covered the digging, but what about the lining of the tunnel? You can't just let 1,300 CFM of water rip through a wooden timbered tunnel in soft dirt, right? Ultimately, 55% of the tunnel had to be lined with concrete, basically anywhere that it wasn't completely hard granite. But how do you pour concrete in a tunnel that's also a pathway for the trammer pulling material out of the tunnel from the working face, right? We can't stop drilling just to pour concrete. Well, they actually came up with a pretty cool solution. They'd mix the Portland cement with the sand and gravel aggregate that they'd found and screened locally and dumped that into special shafts that went down through the main shaft of the tunnel, where it was drawn by gravity into measuring bins. The Portland cement, aggregate, and water were all mixed in a rotary mixer. They basically built a little concrete plant at the bottom of the main shaft. The finished product, wet concrete, was then poured into special tram cars and trammed to where the concrete was being poured. Where they were pouring, they had a hoist to lift the car and dump the concrete onto an elevated platform where it could be remixed by hand and shoveled into the forms. While the concrete car was up on the hoist, the mucking trammers could pass underneath the whole concrete lining operation with their load from the face. Pretty cool. Just about every local that I run into cites how amazing it was that when headings 1 and 2 met, that's from the East Portal meeting the western face, they were only off by 6 inches when the two faces met. Well, at least so the local legend goes. And yeah, 6 inches in 6 miles is amazing. But a drawing from the engineers show that the actual path of the tunnel varied by a maximum amount of about 3.5 feet from the true center line. Still an incredibly small deviation. And apparently it's straight enough that if you stand at the East Portal with the door closed behind you, you can see daylight from the West Portal 5.8 miles away. Now that is a very straight tunnel. These guys knew what they were doing. All right, we could go on and on about the engineering challenges and the dangers of the work and the miraculous accuracy, la la la. Truth is, this tunnel fought back at every turn, and the team of workers and engineers had incredible grit, unbelievable perseverance, fighting 1 inch at a time for 4 years in conditions that I think are really unimaginable to most of us today. Actually, a lot of historical writers cite a stat that the average stay of laborers was only 2 weeks. Now look, one guy, Arthur Page, said that in an article back in 1907, but I gotta say, I don't believe it. I couldn't find anything in the Bureau of Reclamation's records or any other original source that indicated anything of the sort was true. Maybe that was specific to drillers or muckers. Now, I don't know, but what is factual is that many of the major names on the crew, the guys from the org chart I described earlier, were there for the whole project, from the first cave-in to the ribbon cutting. These guys risked life and limb to keep the tunnel moving forward, and their continuous progress was precarious. A lot of things had to go right for progress to be made. If a stationary engineer fell asleep on the job and the lights went out or the blower stopped, it would cost lives. They had to stock up the east portal down in the canyon with coal, food, dynamite, and other supplies to get through the winter when, after a big snow, the east portal road became impassable for weeks at a time. Imagine Grasser's crew down there drilling and blasting away at the east portal. Their ventilation air and critical water pumping all ultimately provided by coal that had been hauled by train to Luan, then carried by horse team over Vernal Mesa and skidding on a shoe and 3 wheels down the east portal road to the powerhouse. If the road slid out, no coal, no digging. If the coal delivery didn't show up in Luan, no digging. If the pumps stopped working, no digging. If the pipe didn't show up to extend the ventilation pipe, sorry, no digging. If the generator went down with a bad winding, no digging. If the dynamite wasn't delivered, no digging. This was a huge logistical operation with so many ways to fail. Yet, they kept it going pretty much continuously for 4 years. I'm telling you, it's incredible. Let's step back from the engineering and logistics for a minute. At its peak, Luan at the West Portal was home to more than 800 people, and the place had to be hopping. With crews rotating in and out of the tunnel round the clock, you can imagine that there was always someone asleep and always someone getting ready to go on shift. Of course, not all of these workers were bachelors. Many of them, like the Belgarts from the last episode, they came with their kids. And every family knows you can't have one parent working like these guys were without the other parent providing a ton of additional support. And families back then were big. 5 kids was common. Some had up to 10. 10 is just too many for me to imagine. And everyone pitched in to raise the kids of Luan and at the river portal. Both settlements had schools where all grades were mixed in a single room. Kids who didn't live directly in Luan rode their horses to school or walked. But look, folks were poor. Kids walked to school in the winter after a snowstorm with burlap bags on their feet to keep their feet warm. But you don't have to be rich to have fun. So, on Friday nights, the desks were pushed to the side of the schoolroom, there was live music, people brought their dinners in baskets, and there was a dance party. This vibrant, bustling little boomtown had popped up seemingly in the middle of nowhere, from nothing. Then suddenly had families from all over the world. Imagine the schoolroom full of a bunch of kids who are just learning English and natively speak Italian or German or Spanish. Those had to be some brave teachers. What blows my mind about Luan is that if you go visit today, there's nothing. Sure, a couple stables of the current landowner, but literally no sign that the town ever existed on the land. I drove by it 100 times before I knew there was anything ever there. And yet, without it, this valley that now supports the lives of 50,000 people would be a nearly uninhabitable desert. Funny how something that so dramatically changed the course of history is today all but forgotten. Okay, back in the tunnel. In June 1909, something amazing happened. Do you hear that? It happened during a quick break when work was paused for a minute. Could it be? No way. Yes. Yes way. They could, that June of 1909, as heading 1 from the river portal approached heading 2 from the valley, for the first time, hear each other's drilling. Imagine hearing that sound after drilling for 4 years. And on July 6th, 1909, they hold through to each other. It was clear there needed to be a big grand opening, a ribbon cutting like never before. They tried to get Teddy Roosevelt, who'd approved the initial project, but he was hunting in Africa, a rough life. So instead, they got the current president, Howard Taft. Everyone in town went all out for the celebration.
Among the dignitaries in attendance were President Taft, Richard A. Bollinger, Secretary of the Interior, Senator Charles Hughes, Jr., Representative Edward Taylor, Colorado Governor John F. Shafforth, officials of the Reclamation Service including Fellows, Torrance, McConnell, and Luzone.
Remember, he was the guy who 20 years earlier everyone called crazy when he said the idea for a tunnel came to him in a dream. Imagine how he must have felt seeing this tunnel completed.
In addition, thousands of sightseers came from all over the western slope. A special train from Delta brought 1,500, and 300 came on a special from Gunnison. 36 automobiles drove over from Delta, the occupants carrying red and white umbrellas. Ouray brought a pack train in charge of A.E. Finney, showing the means of transportation in the rich mines. The event was heralded as the biggest event that ever happened in Montrose. Bands from Ouray, Ridgway, Olathe, Lake City, Montrose, and Delta were on hand, including girls' bands in natty uniforms. The Grand Army of the Republic made a fine showing in the parade, as did the Boosters Association and the Colorado National Guard. Montrose contributed its prettiest girls riding on horseback to the parade. On the main thoroughfare of town, there was a welcome arch consisting of products of the rich agricultural county and telling how much had been raised during the past year and what the completion of the tunnel would mean for 1910.
Look, they all crowded around the west portal, and Taft touched a golden bell to a plate that was apparently connecting a circuit to raise a gate at the east portal. But guess what? The tunnel wasn't actually done yet. So some guys walked back up the tunnel and built a dam. And when they got the signal, they broke the dam to allow the symbolic water to flow through for the dignitaries. I kind of picture McConnell standing on the platform next to the president, rolling his eyes, knowing how the water was actually being released, while the crowd cheered. And everything went off without a hitch, except for when, I'll let the New York Times reporter tell you.
Only one little incident marred the president's visit. At the conclusion of the tunnel opening, one of the 32 Colorado sheriffs who have accompanied the president across the state got into an altercation with H.L. Daniels, superintendent of the tunnel, when the latter was trying to shake hands with the president. Mr. Daniels was knocked down and for a time troubled was threatened, as his friends were quick to resent the action of the officer, who during the scuffle pulled an enormous pistol from his belt. The president heard the quarreling and stopped for a moment as he was making his way to the train. He was told there was nothing serious, however, and proceeded.
According to the 1905 org chart I saw at the National Archives, H.L. Daniels was the timekeeper at the river portal, and according to this Times article, he was the superintendent by the time in 1909. And look, considering what H.L. Daniels and his crews had been through, how many wives had he had to tell of a fallen husband in the tunnel? I'm just going to go ahead and say, I think this guy deserved a handshake from the president, and I don't blame his friends, probably also other East Portal crew, for sticking up for him. But look, presidents being presidents and sheriffs being sheriffs, remember how this story started in Telluride? Sheriffs did not mess around back then. H.L. Daniels was snubbed and probably had a 6-shooter Colt 45 put in his face. All right, so you might think we're done. The golden bell's been rung, the president's off on his way, we're ready to talk about the canals and the system's operation today, right? Well, I'm sorry to report that not yet. It turns out that the tunnel's deadliest and least studied accident occurred almost 4 months after President Taft's visit. It's 3 p.m. on Sunday, January 16th, 1910. Time for a shift change. The 8 a.m. crew going off shift had just fired 50 holes. The tram from the river portal carrying 24 men in the 3 o'clock crew had just arrived. The morning crew clocking out had boarded and were headed out of the tunnel on the tram. The new crew sat down about 500 feet from the face to let the smoke clear away as usual. And then, according to the official statement of the on-duty engineer at the time to the local paper, the draft, which had been toward the west end of the tunnel, suddenly changed direction to the east and slowly swept the whole volume of smoke back over the waiting workmen, unquote. However, quote, the accident was a most remarkable one. The air currents shifted twice. First, they brought the deadly volume of gas and smoke past the men, and within a few minutes, the currents had changed and brought the gases back again, and the men were plunged into a noxious vapor shroud for a second time, end quote. Look, the coroner performed an inquest, and the jury returned a verdict of accidental death. But here again, just like in the cave-in 1905, hindsight is 20/20. In the 9th annual report of the Reclamation Service that was written and submitted after this accident occurred, they described the ventilation system in this area in some length and specifically say the ventilation pipelines were, quote, being used intermittently as suction lines and as pressure lines. Immediately after blasting, the blowers were operated for about an hour as suction fans, drawing foul air from the heading. As soon as the powder smoke was well cleared out, the blowers were reversed and blew a draft of cool air into the heading. So this was definitely a known issue, and they clearly had control over the direction of airflow in the area. But both ends of the tunnel were open, and maybe the wind blew really hard from one end or the other. I don't know. Here's what I think happened. There's a shift change, and that included the engineer operating the blower that was on top of the tunnel. The new guy finds the blower in the exhaust direction and makes a mistake, maybe thinking the exhaust from the last blast had already cleared. Maybe the handoff communication from the outgoing engineer was sloppy. I don't know, maybe he was late and there was no handoff. However it happened, I think he reversed the blower's direction, pushing the explosion gases back down into the tunnel and over the crew the first time. They, choking to death, make a call to the east portal, asking for rescue. That did actually happen. And somewhere in there, the blower operator realizes he's made a grave mistake and reverses the blowers again, putting them back in the exhaust mode, this time pulling the gases over the crew a second time. I don't think anyone will ever actually know, but I sure don't think the natural ventilation reversed direction twice in a few minutes like that. Look, whether human error or natural cause, it was a tragedy. 5 died that day, and 4 more in the following days from their injuries, 9 total from this tragic ventilation accident. I mentioned the Hoosac Tunnel earlier. It was the longest tunnel to date in the U.S. and was completed 34 years before the Gunnison Tunnel. But workers in the Hoosac called it a bloody pit. Twice as many workers were seriously injured compared to the Gunnison Tunnel, and 135 died in the Hoosac compared to the 26 in the Gunnison Tunnel. I certainly don't mean to diminish the sacrifice of those lost to the Gunnison Tunnel. I simply want to credit the management of this project as dramatically improved over similar projects before them. They did pretty well for the time. I've covered the 9 deaths from this ventilation accident, plus the 6 from the very first cave-in. That brings us to 15. The additional 11 went like this. 2 were killed when one of them used a metal rod to tamp his dynamite into a hole instead of the wooden rods they'd been provided. 1 had his neck broken when a chain broke that had been suspending a cart, probably a concrete cart, from the roof of the tunnel, and it hit him. 2 guys were crushed between 2 cars in 2 separate incidents. 3 were killed from falling rock in 3 separate incidents. 1 was electrocuted, and 1 fell through the main shaft. And 1 was crushed from a falling timber. That brings the total to 26 lives lost to this project. As I record this, I'm looking out at hundreds of acres of the southern Uncompahgre Valley, all of which is flooded with water from the Gunnison Tunnel every irrigation season. Thousands of homes, vans shuttling skiers to Telluride. Behind me, the city of Montrose is a healthy economy, rooted in agriculture, but growing, shaped by today's agricultural producers, today's entrepreneurs, today's dreamers. And I can't help but think, none of this would be here without this tunnel. Were it not for this water, I'd be staring at sagebrush and prickly pear cactus. The Gunnison Tunnel is the primary source of raw water to the treatment plant that supplies the entire Uncompahgre Valley with potable water. In the winter, it's the only source. The other source in the summer is the Cimarron Ditch. This project almost failed on so many occasions, whether it for being thought crazy or impossible or too expensive or too deadly. But too many people drink this water and water their lawns with this water or eat sweet corn and onions grown with this water, and have no idea what it took to make it available. I hope that now you know, and the next time you take a bite of Olathe sweet corn at a July 4th barbecue, you remember the 26 men who gave their lives and the countless others who persevered through adversity we can scarcely imagine to turn what started out as a dream into our reality. In the next episode, we'll learn how they intended to get all this water distributed over their planned 140,000 acres, and about how the project is operated today and benefits the Uncompahgre Valley. We'll see you next time. Special thanks in this episode goes to Elaine Hale-Jones, whose book West of the Divide, East of the Desert was informative on what life was like around Lujane. Thanks, Elaine. Also, Richard Elsom, an archivist at the National Archives in Denver. Without him, I'd have never found the blueprinted org chart and schematics. Thanks, Richard. And to Mallory McAdams and her advisor Judith Wang at the Colorado School of Mines. Their paper on the civil engineering, and especially the references their paper steered me to, provided most of the engineering content I found for this episode. Thanks so much to everyone.